He was just an ordinary man working the night shift at a factory. Until he discovered during his patrol that the production line that was supposed to be empty was running. His 30 years of police experience told him one thing. This wasn't just overtime work. This was a covert operation, and now he was the only witness to this secret. But before we dive into this incredible story, if you're new here, welcome to The Last Witness. We share the most amazing untold stories of ordinary people with extraordinary secrets. Stories where someone becomes the final witness to incredible events. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest stories. And if you enjoy this story, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps us continue bringing you these incredible tales. Now let's get back to Frank's story. Frank Wilson had been working the night security shift at Meridian Manufacturing for 3 years, and he'd settled into a routine that suited him perfectly. At 62, after 30 years as a police detective in Detroit, Frank appreciated work that was predictable, solitary, and largely uneventful. The Meridian manufacturing facility produced automotive parts for major car companies, brake components, transmission parts, and engine accessories. It was legitimate, profitable work that employed about 200 people during the day shift. But at night, the factory was supposed to be completely empty except for Frank and the automated security systems. Frank's job was simple: patrol the facility every 2 hours, check that all doors and windows were secure, monitor the security cameras, and ensure that no unauthorized personnel entered the building. In 3 years, the most excitement he'd encountered was a false alarm triggered by a raccoon that had somehow gotten into the loading dock. That quiet predictability was exactly what Frank had been looking for when he retired from the Detroit Police Department. Frank's police career had ended not with the fanfare of a decorated retirement ceremony, but with the bitter disappointment of a case that had consumed the last 5 years of his service. He'd been the lead detective investigating a series of armed robberies that had terrorized Detroit's business district. The case had every element that made detective work both fascinating and frustrating: sophisticated planning, inside knowledge, and a criminal organization that seemed to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. Frank had developed detailed theories about how the robbery ring operated, identified patterns in their target selection, and even pinpointed several suspects who fit the psychological profiles. But every time he'd gotten close to making arrests, the evidence would disappear, witnesses would recant their statements, or key suspects would vanish before warrants could be served. After 5 years of investigation, Frank had become convinced that the robbery ring had protection from within the police department itself. Someone with access to investigative files and operational plans was feeding information to the criminals, allowing them to avoid capture and continue their activities. Frank had tried to pursue his corruption theories through official channels, but his supervisors were reluctant to investigate fellow officers based on circumstantial evidence. Frank's insistence that there was a conspiracy within the department earned him a reputation as a paranoid detective who saw corruption everywhere. When Frank reached his 30-year service mark and became eligible for full retirement benefits, his captain strongly suggested that it was time for him to step away from active investigation and enjoy his golden years. The message was clear. Frank's theories about police corruption were no longer welcome, and his continued presence was becoming disruptive to department morale. Frank retired with full honors and a pension that allowed him to live comfortably, but he left the force feeling like he'd failed to solve the most important case of his career. He'd spent 30 years building a reputation as a thorough, dedicated detective, only to end his career as the paranoid old cop who couldn't accept that some cases simply couldn't be solved. The transition to civilian life was difficult. Frank had defined himself through police work for 3 decades. He'd never married, had few close relationships outside the department, and had no hobbies or interests beyond law enforcement. Retirement left him feeling purposeless and disconnected from the work that had given his life meaning. The night security position at Meridian Manufacturing wasn't exciting work, but it provided Frank with structure and a sense of purpose. The factory needed someone with his experience and attention to detail, and Frank appreciated having responsibilities that mattered, even if they were relatively mundane. More importantly, the job allowed Frank to use his investigative skills in a low-pressure environment. He approached factory security with the same methodical thoroughness that had characterized his police work, developing detailed patrol procedures, studying the facility's vulnerabilities, and maintaining comprehensive logs of his observations. Frank's diligence had been appreciated by Meridian's management. The facility had experienced significant reductions in theft and vandalism since he'd been hired. His background checks on day shift employees had identified several workers with criminal histories who posed security risks. His recommendations for improved lighting and camera placement had enhanced the facility's overall security posture. But Frank's police instincts had also picked up on details that troubled him, even though he couldn't identify any specific policy violations or security breaches. The facility operated with unusual secrecy for a company that manufactured standard automotive parts. Access to certain areas was restricted even for employees with high-level security clearances. Some equipment deliveries occurred outside normal business hours, with special arrangements that bypassed standard receiving procedures. Most concerning to Frank was the behavior of certain management personnel. Several executives regularly worked late hours in parts of the facility where no manufacturing was scheduled. These after-hours activities were always explained as administrative work or special projects. But Frank's experience had taught him to be suspicious when people's stated activities didn't match their observed behavior patterns. Frank had documented his observations in detailed security reports, but his supervisors had shown little interest in his concerns. They assured him that all activities at the facility were legitimate business operations and that his job was to provide security, not to investigate management decisions. Frank accepted these explanations, but his detective instincts remained alert to the possibility that something unusual was happening at Meridian Manufacturing. That possibility became a certainty on a Thursday night in November 2023. Frank was conducting his midnight patrol when he noticed something that immediately grabbed his attention. Lights were on in Production Area C, and he could hear the sound of machinery running. According to the facility schedule, Production Area C was supposed to be shut down for maintenance until the following Monday. The entire section had been closed for 3 days, with all equipment powered down and all personnel reassigned to other areas. Frank checked his security logs to confirm that no special work orders had been issued for overnight maintenance. He contacted the facility manager's emergency line, but received no response. According to all official documentation, Production Area C should have been completely empty and inactive. But Frank could clearly see lights, hear machinery, and even detect the faint sounds of human activity coming from the supposedly closed production area. Frank's 30 years of police experience told him that this wasn't a mistake or a miscommunication. Someone was conducting unauthorized activities in a part of the facility that was supposed to be closed, and they were doing it during hours when they thought no one would notice. Frank approached Production Area C carefully, using his security master key to access the area while remaining as quiet as possible. What he discovered inside made his blood run cold. The production line was indeed running, but it wasn't manufacturing automotive parts. Instead, the machinery had been reconfigured to produce what appeared to be weapons components, specifically parts for automatic firearms that were far more sophisticated than anything that should have been manufactured in a civilian facility. Frank recognized the components from his police training. He was looking at parts for fully automatic assault rifles, high-capacity ammunition magazines, and what appeared to be components for explosive devices. The production setup was professional and efficient, suggesting that this wasn't the first time the facility had been used for this purpose. But most disturbing was the realization that this wasn't a theft or unauthorized use of the facility. The production run was too organized, too sophisticated, and too well integrated with the facility's existing systems to be the work of criminals who had broken in. This was an inside operation involving people with legitimate access to the facility and detailed knowledge of its capabilities. Frank retreated from Production Area C and returned to the security office, his mind racing through the implications of what he'd discovered. Meridian Manufacturing wasn't just a legitimate automotive parts company that was being exploited by criminals. It was actively participating in the illegal production of weapons and doing so under the cover of normal business operations. Frank's first instinct was to call the police immediately, but his experience with the Detroit Police Department had taught him to be cautious about involving law enforcement in complex investigations. If Meridian Manufacturing had been operating an illegal weapons production facility for an extended period, they likely had protection from corruption within law enforcement agencies. Frank decided to gather more evidence before contacting authorities. Over the next week, he carefully documented the unauthorized production activities, photographing equipment configurations, recording vehicle license plates of people who visited the facility during off hours, and mapping the times and patterns of the illegal operations. What Frank discovered was even more extensive than he'd initially realized. The weapons production wasn't limited to Production Area C. Other parts of the facility were being used to manufacture different types of illegal equipment: surveillance devices, communication jammers, and what appeared to be components for improvised explosive devices. The operation was sophisticated and well organized, involving dozens of people who had coordinated access to the facility. Some were employees who worked their regular day jobs and then returned at night for the illegal production activities. Others appeared to be specialists who were brought in specifically for the weapons manufacturing. Frank also discovered that the illegal production was connected to a distribution network that moved the finished weapons to buyers across the Midwest. Trucks would arrive at the facility during predetermined hours, load the illegal products, and transport them to unknown destinations. But the most shocking discovery came when Frank recognized one of the people involved in the operation: Detective Ray Martinez from the Detroit Police Department. Martinez had been Frank's partner for 2 years during the investigation of the armed robbery ring. He'd had access to all of Frank's investigative files, knew every detail of the case, and had been in a perfect position to warn the criminals whenever law enforcement was getting close to making arrests. Frank realized that his theories about police corruption had been correct. The robbery ring had indeed been protected by corrupt officers, and Martinez had been the leak that allowed the criminals to avoid capture for 5 years. But Martinez's involvement in the weapons manufacturing operation suggested that the corruption was far more extensive than Frank had suspected. This wasn't just a detective taking bribes to protect criminals. This was an organized network that used law enforcement resources to facilitate illegal activities on a massive scale. Frank faced the same dilemma that had frustrated him during his final years with the Detroit Police Department. How could he expose corruption when he didn't know which law enforcement officials could be trusted? Frank decided to contact the FBI directly, bypassing local and state law enforcement agencies that might be compromised by the same corruption network. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh met with Frank at a coffee shop 20 miles from the Meridian facility. Frank presented his evidence methodically, explaining the weapons production activities he documented and the connection to corrupt Detroit police officers. Agent Walsh was immediately interested. "Mr. Wilson, we've been investigating reports of illegal weapons trafficking in the Midwest for over a year. The operation you've discovered appears to be a significant source of weapons that have been used in crimes across multiple states. How extensive do you think this network is? Based on what you've shown me, this could involve dozens of corrupt law enforcement officers, multiple manufacturing facilities, and criminal organizations in several major cities," Agent Walsh explained. "Your evidence suggests that we're looking at one of the largest police corruption cases in decades." Agent Walsh asked Frank to continue his security work at Meridian while serving as an undercover informant for the FBI. Frank would maintain his normal patrol routine while secretly documenting the illegal activities and gathering intelligence about the people involved in the operation. Frank agreed to cooperate, but he also insisted on certain protections. "Agent Walsh, I spent 5 years trying to expose this corruption through official channels, and it nearly destroyed my career. I need assurance that this investigation will be handled with complete security." "Mr. Wilson, this investigation is being conducted by a task force that specializes in law enforcement corruption. Everyone involved has been thoroughly vetted, and all communications will be handled through secure channels." Over the next 3 months, Frank provided the FBI with detailed intelligence about the weapons manufacturing operation. His position as night security guard gave him perfect cover for observing and documenting activities that the criminals thought were hidden from outside observation. The evidence Frank gathered revealed the scope of a conspiracy that exceeded even the FBI's initial estimates. The illegal weapons production network involved corrupt officers from police departments in 6 different cities, manufacturing facilities in 4 states, and criminal organizations that distributed the weapons as far away as the East Coast. But Frank's most valuable contribution to the investigation was his identification of the network's leadership structure. By carefully observing who gave orders, who received special treatment, and who had access to the most sensitive areas of the operation, Frank was able to help the FBI map the hierarchy of the criminal organization. The key figure was Colonel James Morrison, a retired Army officer who had used his military connections to recruit corrupt law enforcement personnel and establish the manufacturing capabilities needed to produce military-grade weapons in civilian facilities. Morrison had been systematically corrupting police officers by offering them lucrative positions in his organization after their retirement from law enforcement. The promise of high-paying security consulting work had attracted officers who were willing to provide protection and intelligence to Morrison's operation while they were still active duty. Frank's evidence also revealed that Morrison's network had been responsible for the armed robberies that had frustrated Frank's investigation during his final years with the Detroit Police Department. The robberies had been a way to fund the weapons manufacturing operation while testing the effectiveness of their police protection. The FBI raid on Meridian Manufacturing was conducted on a Tuesday night in February 2024, when Frank's intelligence indicated that a major production run was scheduled. Federal agents arrested 23 people at the facility, including 8 current or former law enforcement officers. The evidence seized during the raid linked the network to over 200 violent crimes across the Midwest, including bank robberies, drug trafficking operations, and several high-profile assassinations. The weapons produced at Meridian had been used in crimes that had resulted in dozens of deaths and millions of dollars in losses. Colonel Morrison was arrested at his home in Michigan and charged with conspiracy, weapons trafficking, and racketeering. During his interrogation, he revealed the full scope of the corruption network and provided information that led to additional arrests in multiple states. Detective Ray Martinez was arrested at his desk in the Detroit Police Department and charged with conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and accepting bribes. His cooperation with Morrison's network had allowed criminals to operate freely for over a decade, while law enforcement resources were wasted on investigations that were doomed to fail. Agent Walsh called Frank after Morrison's conviction to thank him for his contribution to the investigation. "Mr. Wilson, your decision to document and report the illegal activities at Meridian Manufacturing led to the arrest of one of the most dangerous criminal networks we've ever encountered. You prevented weapons from reaching criminals who would have used them to commit countless violent crimes." Frank felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. His theories about police corruption had been proven correct, but the validation had come at the cost of learning that the law enforcement profession he'd dedicated his life to had been more deeply corrupted than he'd ever imagined. "Agent Walsh, what happens now? How do we prevent this kind of corruption from happening again?" "Investigations like this one help us identify weaknesses in our systems and develop better methods for detecting corruption," Agent Walsh replied. "But the most important factor is having people like you who are willing to speak up when they see something wrong, even when it's difficult or dangerous to do so." Frank continued working as a night security guard at Meridian Manufacturing, which resumed normal automotive parts production under new management and enhanced federal oversight. His role in exposing the weapons trafficking network remained classified, but Frank found satisfaction in knowing that his work had made a meaningful contribution to public safety. Frank also began working as a consultant for the FBI, using his experience with police corruption to help train federal agents in recognizing signs of law enforcement misconduct. His insights into how corrupt officers operated helped improve investigative techniques and prevent similar networks from developing. But Frank's most important realization was that his years of feeling like a failed detective had been misguided. He hadn't failed to solve the corruption case during his police career. He'd been investigating a criminal network that was far more sophisticated and well-protected than anyone had realized. Frank's persistence in pursuing his theories about police corruption, even when his supervisors discouraged him, had ultimately led to one of the most significant law enforcement corruption prosecutions in decades. On quiet nights during his security patrols at Meridian Manufacturing, Frank often reflected on the path that had led him from frustrated detective to unwitting federal informant to key witness in a major corruption case. His police career had ended with the disappointment of unsolved cases and unproven theories about corruption. But that same dedication to investigation and truth-telling had put him in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time, to expose a criminal network that posed a serious threat to public safety. Frank had learned that sometimes justice works slowly, and that the most important cases were often the ones that took years or even decades to fully understand and resolve. The last witness to his own professional disappointments had become the first line of defense against those who would corrupt the institutions meant to protect society. It wasn't the police career Frank had planned, but it was the contribution to justice that his community needed him to make. And that, he'd learned, was more than enough purpose for any detective, active duty or retired. Thank you for listening to this incredible story here on The Last Witness. If you enjoyed Frank's journey from frustrated detective to unlikely federal informant and want to hear more amazing tales of ordinary people who become the final witnesses to extraordinary events, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you these untold stories that deserve to be heard. What did you think about Frank's decision to pursue his corruption theories even after retirement? Do you believe persistence in seeking the truth is always worth the personal cost? Let us know in the comments below. We love hearing your thoughts on these stories. And remember, sometimes the most important investigations happen not in police stations, but in the quiet hours when someone refuses to ignore what they've witnessed. Until next time, keep listening and keep witnessing the truth.